Alors, bonjour tout le monde, bonjour à tous et à toutes. Mon nom est Luc Turgeon et donc c'est avec beaucoup de plaisir que je présiderai aujourd'hui le lancement de l'ouvrage de mon collègue et ami André Lecourt, Nationalism, Secessionism, and Autonomy. So thank you all for coming today to this event. It's a great pleasure to have this opportunity to host this event for the launch of André's book. Let me first say that this is an event organized by the Center on Governance of the University of Ottawa, the former Federation, as well as the Jean-Luc Pepin Research Chair, also of the University of Ottawa. So before starting this event, let me first present our panelists. Like I said, I'm Luc Turgeon, I'm an associate professor here at the School of Political Studies at the University of Ottawa. First, among our panelists, most important panelists today, the man of the hour is André Lecourt, who is a professor also at the School of Political Studies here at the University of Ottawa. Et André est également le directeur de recherche de l'axe fédéralisme et gouvernance multiniveau au Centre d'études en gouvernance de l'Université d'Ottawa. Second, we have with us today from Berlin, I believe, the Honorable Stéphane Dion, who is Canada's ambassador to Germany and the special envoy to the European Union. Monsieur Dion a bien entendu également précédemment été ministre des Affaires étrangères, ministre de l'Environnement, ministre des Affaires intergouvernementales et surtout pour plusieurs d'entre nous, il a été d'abord et avant tout un politologue, professeur de sciences politiques à l'Université de Montréal pendant plusieurs années. And finally, the last panelist is Stephanie Kerr, who is a professor at the Department of Political Studies at the University of Lethbridge. Et mentionnons également, parce qu'on en est fiers, qu'elle est une ancienne doctorante de notre université. Et donc, c'est un plaisir de la revoir virtuellement parmi nous. So each of our panelists will make a presentation of approximately 10 minutes, and then we will move on to a question period. And so feel free to ask any question you might have in the Q&A box. And this is a bilingual event, so feel free to ask your question either in English or in French. Before I give the floor to André, I think Felix Knupling of the former Federation will say a few words.
Thank you very much, Luc, and also a very warm welcome from my side. I'm Felix Knupling, I'm Vice President of the former Federations. Very happy to have this distinguished panel in the room and so many participants. Thank you to André and his team for putting this together. I think this is a very timely book and a very interesting subject that touches on a lot of the work that we do as the forum and that we do jointly in collaboration with the University of Ottawa. So very happy to have this partnership come to fruition in the sense of putting this panel together. I mean, I'm very much looking forward to the presentation, the comments, and then obviously the question and answers. It's great to have a global audience with us today. And again, warm welcome from my side. Back to you, Luc.
Thank you, Felix. And on that note, André, I will give you the floor for the presentation of your book.
Merci, Luc, et merci à tous et à toutes d'être ici virtuellement. Je vais commencer mon allocution en anglais et je vais la finir en français. Et je vais simplement résumer un peu là, les arguments principaux de mon livre et peut-être son importance relative là, dans le monde universitaire et des études sur le nationalisme. So why are some nationalist movements strongly secessionist? That's really the question that I pose in this book. Why is the predominant objective of some nationalist movements outright independence as opposed to increased autonomy within the state? I say predominant because, of course, nationalist movements are almost always internally divided between autonomous and secessionist streams. So there's potential for the movement as a whole to go either way towards increased autonomy or outright independence. Therefore, the book is not about the origins of nationalism, but it's really about what makes secessionism strong within the nationalist movement of an advanced industrialized liberal democracy. My ontological view here is that nationalist movements in these democracies are here to stay, and that multinational democracies, for political and institutional reasons, not for essentialist reasons, are perennial. The normative basis that's at the heart of my interest for secessionism is really the question of how to preserve multinational democracies and how to keep them relatively free of severe conflict, understanding that there'll always be tensions within multinational democracies. Empirically, it's really the cases of Catalonia and Scotland that drew me into this line of investigation on secessionism, especially in Western Europe, because the referendum, the Scottish independence referendum of 2014, the attempted Catalan independence referendum of 2017, really were not things that were supposed to happen if you read the literature in the 1990s and the early 2000s. So the sense was that this was an era, of course, in Europe of deep European integration, which would create all kinds of avenues for minority nations to have agency. The sense was also that these states in the United Kingdom, in Spain and elsewhere had accommodated their minority nations in a way that would make the search for independence redundant. And there was more broadly, of course, a discourse on globalization suggesting that borders were becoming less and less relevant. So struggling for an independent state was largely seen as passé in the 90s and the 2000s. Now, the strengthening of secessionism as we saw it in Scotland and Catalonia was therefore surprising, and it was even more surprising because it didn't happen in all minority nations, right? In Flanders, the Dutch-speaking community of Belgium, the Flemish nationalist movement remained overwhelmingly autonomist. And in South Tyrol, the German-speaking community of Northern Italy up in the Alps also remained overwhelmingly autonomist. And this happened despite the fact that it would have been entirely plausible or even expected for Flemish nationalism and nationalism in South Tyrol to become more strongly secessionist. Belgium, of course, having experienced all kinds of existential crises and crises in the formation of government. And in South Tyrol, well, there was a massive history of secessionism and irredentism, that is reunification, the claim to be reunified with Austria. So to understand what leads to strong secessionism, I conducted a controlled comparison between, on the one hand, Scotland and Catalonia, and on the other hand, Flanders and South Tyrol, looking for what was shared by Catalonia and Scotland on the one hand, and what Scotland and Catalonia really had that was not shared by Flanders and South Tyrol. So in looking for this, well, I can tell you what I found. And what I found was that it's not the degree or the design of autonomy that really determines the strength of secessionism. It's not how much autonomy a minority nation has or how this autonomy is designed institutionally, but rather it's what I call in the book the nature of autonomy that's important. It's how autonomy is deployed in time. And here in the book, I make what I think is a conceptual kind of innovation, or at least a conceptual distinction between static and dynamic autonomy. So autonomy is dynamic if it expands or adjusts laterally in time, and autonomy is static if it is a final and unchangeable settlement. So in a nutshell, my conclusion, or the theory of secessionism that I put forward in the book, is that static autonomy stimulates secessionism while dynamic autonomy staves it off. So how does this work? I think that static autonomy places members of a minority nation before only two self-determination options: independence and the status quo. So it does generate incentives for supporting secessionism. Dynamic autonomy, on the other hand, involves self-determination options other than independence in the status quo in the form of increased or adjusted autonomy. As a result, dynamic autonomy reduces incentives for supporting secession. To put it in historical institutionalist terms, which is the framework that I was inspired by to conduct this research, autonomy that does not adapt to evolving processes of nationalism, the construction of identity, the definition of national interest, well, that type of autonomy that doesn't adapt generates tension between the institutional and social political orders of the minority nation. So this tension between the changing social political orders and still institutional order, that comes out in the form of secessionism. An autonomy that adapts to changing circumstances, including the transformation and the articulation of identity and of interest, keeps the institutional and the social political orders of the minority nation congruent, thereby eliminating much of the potential for secessionism. Je passe en français maintenant et je vais maintenant parler de au moins 2 cas supplémentaires que j'ai considérés dans le livre, dont le Canada, et je vais discuter quelques minutes de ce que ces cas amènent à la théorie. Et donc, je pense que le Canada montre que l'autonomie peut être statique ou dynamique, dépendamment de la manière dont elle est gérée. Et donc, pour le Canada, tenter de gérer l'autonomie du Québec par le biais de la Constitution la rend statique, rend l'autonomie du Québec statique, puisqu'évidemment, on sait que les changements constitutionnels, dans ce sens, se sont révélés impossibles. L'autonomie du Québec est plus dynamique, donc elle s'ajuste mieux aux circonstances changeantes, lorsqu'elle est gérée complètement par les voies du fédéralisme canadien, c'est-à-dire les ententes dites intergouvernementales. Et de fait, lorsque l'accent a été mis sur la Constitution pour gérer l'autonomie du Québec, donc en gros dans les années 80 jusqu'en 1995, c'est pendant cette période que le sécessionnisme a été à son plus fort. Donc ici, je rejoins un peu là, les propos passés de Stéphane Dion qui disait que le fédéralisme canadien fonctionne mieux en pratique qu'en théorie. L'autre cas intéressant que j'ai examiné rapidement dans le livre, c'est celui de Porto Rico, un territoire américain qui pose la question de l'importance des perceptions par rapport à la réalité objective pour ce qui est du caractère dynamique ou statique de l'autonomie. En gros, une question qu'on peut se poser, c'est est-ce que c'est la réalité objective de la nature de l'autonomie qui est importante ou c'est la manière dont les citoyens l'aperçoivent? Et donc, à Porto Rico, l'autonomie a été objectivement statique depuis l'entente de l'État libre et associé avec les États-Unis. Mais les nombreux référendums sur le statut de l'île, il y en a eu 6, font en sorte que les Portoricains peuvent raisonnablement penser ou puissent avoir l'impression, probablement erronée, mais ils peuvent raisonnablement avoir l'impression qu'ils peuvent déterminer l'avenir politique et constitutionnel du territoire américain. Donc ici, c'est la perception d'un potentiel de changement qui a limité l'appui au sécessionnisme à Puerto Rico, qui est en fait très, très bon. Donc, c'est un peu ce que je voulais dire. Je vais arrêter mes commentaires ici et laisser la parole à nos 2 autres invités.
Merci, André. Et maintenant, donc, je donne la parole à Stéphanie Kerr.
Alors, parfait, merci. So I'd just start by saying I really enjoyed reading the book, and I do appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts and maybe talk a little bit about some of the contributions it makes to how we understand governance. I'd start by saying that the theory as presented is quite elegant in its simplicity, but it's a simplicity that's somewhat deceiving. And I mean this in the sense that it only appears simple because of the clarity with which the mechanism, here the nature of autonomy, is actually laid out. This focus on the evolution or potential for evolution of the nature of autonomy in time actually allows for a remarkable degree of nuance and adaptability that permits us to really explore different contexts and interactions. This exploration of the nature of autonomy in time allows us then to pay greater attention to the relationship between the internal nationalist community and the state which houses it, the way in which they read and interpret each other's actions and intentions, provoke each other, react to one another, all on an ongoing basis. And in so doing, as the text points out, we have space to examine both agency and structure and how they weigh on the dynamics of the interactions between the communities in question and their host states. So it's really this question of interaction where I'll get started, leaning a little bit more to the agency side of things, first of all. The text notes, and as Andrew just mentioned as well, the importance of perceptions of dynamism in autonomy arrangements as being potentially just as important as the degree to which dynamism actually exists when it comes to understanding the radicalization of positions towards secessionism. And again, that Puerto Rican example pretty aptly demonstrates that. But I'd like to maybe push that question a little bit further. So if we accept that the perception of autonomy arrangements as either dynamic or static can be as potentially impactful as the degree to which it might be more objectively assessed as static or dynamic, then we necessarily run into questions of strategy, of framing, and of resonance. So a movement which, as we said, perceives autonomy arrangements to be dynamics and potentially amendable is less likely to push for secessionism. But information, in this case, the nature of autonomy, doesn't exist in a vacuum. It needs to be collected, organized, analyzed, and be made meaningful if it is to allow for a movement and its supporters to actually mobilize towards secession or not. So to use the language of social movement theory, information and ideas need to be packaged. The ideas and the stances need to be framed, and that frame needs to find resonance in its target audience if it's going to have any chance of impacting mobilization. And we can certainly debate the degree to which this is an amorphous or directed process, but generally speaking, political and social movement actors are actively involved in the formation and dissemination of such frames. So the question really becomes, what impacts the ability of either state actors or actors within the internal nationalist communities to shape and disseminate frames that would suggest that either the state is staid and static and the secessionism is required, or that the current relationship is sufficiently dynamic as to disincentivize secessionism, which then brings us to that question of strategy. So political parties require a degree of support from the base, and in some cases a broader movement, but they also seek to shape those preferences. So to what extent are the framings of autonomy arrangements subject to the decisions and the strategies of those key actors themselves? A second consideration with respect to that element of interactions that the theory highlights requires maybe a little bit closer look at the case of Catalonia. The text notes that, for instance, the neighboring Basque country, given its history of political violence with respect to nationalism, makes it an exceptional case in that the legacy of violence continues to color political preferences and interactions and even strategy among Basque nationalists. And certainly the text makes mention of the idea that many Basque nationalists and actors took sort of a wait and see attitude with respect to what was happening in Catalonia. And I would add that there was no small degree of I told you so as well. And by this, I mean that Basque nationalists, both of the more moderate strain represented within the sort of Basque Nationalist Party, as well as the more radical branch that finds its electoral representation in Euskal Herria Bildu and its predecessors, they have really a long history of trying and failing to negotiate with the state. And given in particular the express unilateral strategy adopted by the nationalist left in the past decade or so, they likely would not really have expected the Catalan secessionist strategy to have been met with much success. And this can tie back to what the text mentions in that legacy of political violence. The presence of political violence was long used by the Spanish state to delegitimize Basque nationalism, even in its far more moderate forms. But given that Catalonia and the autonomous community of the Basque country exist within the same state, it would be difficult to argue that the contagion of violence did not also lend itself to the delegitimization of Catalan nationalism in the eyes of the state, and certainly among many Basque citizens as well, or sorry, Spanish citizens as well. So then the particular dynamics of the presence of multiple vocal internal national communities in Spain may highlight the need to look at a more complex web of interactions rather than solely those of the state and Catalonia. The third of the points I'd like to consider is that question of applicability to other cases. The case selection clearly controls for a number of potentially relevant intervening variables. It allows for a focus on autonomy structures and dynamics themselves. The selection of cases in liberal democracies also helps to control for questions of state capacity, and as the text mentions, reduces the relevance of current, though not necessarily historic, political and civil rights abuses to which the eternal nationalist community may have been subject, as contributing towards that secessionist push. And the focus on autonomy structures, on nationalism as such, also ties us to territorially bounded communities. I would, however, be really curious to hear what your thoughts might be as to what lessons we could extract from the text and this dynamic interpretation of state and community relations that might be applicable to communities who are not so clearly territorially bound, or whose territorial boundaries might be differently or less simply drawn. And I'm thinking here, for instance, of sovereignty and self-governance arrangements in Indigenous communities, whether here in Canada or further afield. And the last thing I'd like to take a moment to talk on is some of the implications that the text raises, and they are definitely not small in number. And to a certain extent, I think maybe a little bit more further reaching than the text gives them credit for. So the text states that understanding the evolution of autonomy arrangements is important to the state's management of internal nationalist communities in order to stave off secessionism and preserve these multinational states. So this is particularly relevant for questions of stability. However, I would argue it's also inherently statist. It presupposes the continued unity is and should be the final goal of the state in and of itself. But if we were to step outside that position, even if just briefly, there might be room for us to discuss the value of the contributions of this text in another light, namely looking at what it can tell us about quality of governance, about representation, effectiveness, and ultimately about democratic quality. From this perspective, while it is a significant move to go from seeing the internal nationalist community as a problem that needs to be resolved to an ongoing relationship that needs to be managed in order to preserve the state, could we not maybe aspire at least to try to use some of the insights provided here to think about how state institutions can best evolve and be shaped to address the needs and preferences of their constituent communities? In such a way, rather than focusing solely on state unity, we can also look at questions of improving citizen well-being by enhancing their representation, designing policies and structures that may be more effective in addressing their needs, by facilitating and enhancing their access to and exercise of political and civil rights, and in so doing, working towards a more sort of responsive and democratic state. And it truly need to be state. So that's about it for me then.
Thank you very much, Professor Kerr. And now we will hear from the ambassador, Stéphane Dion. Alors, Monsieur Dion, la parole est à vous.
Merci, professeur Turgeon, professeur Lecourt, professeur Kerr, mesdames et messieurs. Merci au Forum des fédérations, au Centre d'études en gouvernance de me permettre de participer à cette importante rencontre. Ma présentation sera en anglais parce que le livre a été écrit en anglais, mais j'ai une version écrite en français disponible. Peut-être les organisateurs pourront s'assurer qu'elle puisse être distribuée. I have written versions in English and French available. I like the book. I had pleasure to read it. I recommend it, but I will make clear that I disagree with the thesis. I don't think dynamic autonomy is an advice you must give to a country that's struggling to stay united. And I don't think its potential of explanation is as strong as Professor Lecourt claims. So I will focus first in my presentation on the advice. Do more autonomy, always more autonomy to keep a country united. I think it's a real wrong advice. And in the discussion, maybe I will have an opportunity to discuss the potential of these concepts in order to explain if a separatist movement will be strong or weak, why I don't think this concept is so relevant. So first, as an advice, the dynamic autonomy. So no, first it is certain that when a democratic state includes within it a region endowed with a particular identity, that state must ensure that its institutional arrangements allow that region to express its identity by means of an adequate autonomy. I agree with that. This autonomy can take different forms: special status, regionalization, federalization. However, and this will be my main point, it would be a mistake for the state to do only that, ensure autonomy. The state must also ensure that the citizens of the region in question are well represented in the common institutions of the country, living together, sharing the same country, working shoulder to shoulder, must be an important part of the country's reality. The diversity of the country must be perceived as a strength. The specific identity of the region, as well as the identity that binds the whole country, must not be seen as a contradiction, but on the contrary, as a formidable complementarity. A substantial national political scene must be maintained, where large national political parties retain a truly national reach, attracting voters from all regions of the country and electing representatives in all regions. The citizens of the region and those of the state as a whole should be encouraged to look with pride at their common achievements across the country, as well as around the world. In other words, a democratic state must strive never to find itself in the very precarious situation described by Professor Lecourt throughout his very interesting book, Nationalism, Secessionism, and Autonomy. This precarious situation is one where the unity of the state is made dependent on, indeed, dynamic autonomy, or in other words, the headlong rush towards ever-increasing autonomy in the regions in the hope of appeasing the secessionist movement in the region. One case of ever more autonomy, on which Professor Lecourt particularly insists in his book, is that of Belgium. He notes that Belgium has never ceased to decentralize itself in accordance with the demands of the Flemish nationalists. Well, my position as a Canadian diplomat prevents me from commenting too much on the domestic politics of another country. However, I will simply say that the Belgian national situation has a strong specificity which one rarely finds elsewhere. And this specificity has a name: Brussels. Yes, Brussels, metropolis and capital of the country, enclosed by Flanders, to which the Flemings are very attached, where their regional parliament sits, but where only about 6% of the inhabitants are Flemings. It is as if Glasgow or Montreal were more than 90% non-Scottish or non-Francophone. Obviously, then, the probability of secession of Scotland or Quebec would be greatly reduced. One wonders which would be the least impossible task: to convince the Flemings to leave Belgium without Brussels, or to convince the people of Brussels to join a Flanders separated from Belgium. One thing is certain: it seemed perilous to propose the endless march towards the evaporation of Belgian federal institutions as a model to be followed in order to stem secessionism in other states. Without a demographic enclave the size of Brussels, the outcome could be quite disastrous for the unity of a country. A state that makes granting dynamic autonomy or ever-increasing autonomy the only or the main antidote to secession, that state risks exposing itself to a series of perverse effects. I will cite 7 of these perverse effects. Together, they make clear why dynamic autonomy can in fact nurture instead of damper secessionism. First, ever greater devolution may lead the central or federal government to neglect or to abandon its responsibilities, which it is best placed to fulfill, resulting in the diminished quality of public service and the diminished usefulness of the country's common institutions as perceived by its citizens. Second, one must not lose sight that one of the engines of the relentless demand for more autonomy is secessionism itself. Indeed, the goal of secessionists is not to have piecemeal powers, symbolic recognition, or increased transfers. It is to have a country of their own. They will take and use the powers ceded to them as a footstep towards obtaining all powers. They will take 50% separation, then 60%, 65% separation, and keep pressing until the ultimate 100%. Each concession is for them an encouragement to ask for more until the final dislocation. The non-secessionist parties in this system of dynamic autonomy are also drawn into it, into this dynamic of relentless demand for increased autonomy in the hope of appeasing the secessionists and winning over some of their voters. Third, ever more autonomy conceived as an imperative for the very preservation of the unity of the country tends to dramatize disproportionately normal disagreements that mark the political life of a state. Any intergovernmental conference on such recurrent matters as, for example, public financing of healthcare, it's always a debate, is seen as the last-ditch conference, the test that will determine whether the country is able to continue to function. Kind of existential crisis all the time. Fourth, this constant pressure to increase ever more powers and resources granted to a specific region with the aim of convincing this region not to separate from the country is a recipe for aggravating regional jealousies. The perception will spread that the central or federal government yields only to the separatists, that the region in question is the spoiled child of the country, that citizens and regions loyal to the country come second, and therefore that other regions should also raise the threat of separation to get the bigger share of the pie. This growing mutual resentment between the region in question and the rest of the country can create a strong feeling among the citizens of the region that they are rejected by their fellow citizens of other regions. Secessionists will use this feeling of rejection to advance their cause. Ultimately, citizens of different regions may come to see their country as a perpetual dispute and separation as a means to achieve peace. Fifth, the ever-growing dynamic autonomy risks introducing a de facto separation of the minds. The citizens of the region in question are more and more entrenched in their territory and come to define themselves by an increasingly more exclusive us. They interact less and less with their fellow citizens of other regions. They come to consider the common institutions as a threat to their nation, a foreign body, or at best, a necessary evil in order to obtain ever more resources. Sixth, as any negative answer to a demand for increased autonomy becomes something inconceivable, unacceptable, a slap in the face of the nation, proving itself that secession is something necessary, dynamic autonomy frees secessionist leaders from the obligation to justify and explain their project. They only have to repeat the mantra, since the state said no to us, let's leave. Ultimately, no further questions are asked about the why and the how of secession. Seventh, and finally, while dynamic autonomy dramatizes the normal disagreements that arise in a country, it trivializes its rupture. Secession itself comes to be seen as something fairly simple to do, the culmination of a continuum towards ever greater autonomy. One comes to forget that secession is in fact a rupture, a heartbreak, the loss of citizenship on the whole of the national territory. Secession is a very serious act, unusual in a democracy, which consists in choosing the fellow citizens that you want to keep and those that you want to transform into foreigners. If democratic states, with few exceptions, reject secession as a constitutional impossibility, if all of them reject unilateral secession, it is because secession contradicts a fundamental democratic principle, the right to citizenship. Indeed, all citizens in a democratic state are entitled to the entire state and hold the right to transmit that citizenship to their children. No group of citizens, even when claiming to form a people or a distinct nation, may take it upon itself to take the country away from other citizens. The secessionist government has no right to unilaterally take the country away from those of its citizens who want to keep it. To borrow words from the Supreme Court of Canada in its reference on the secession of Quebec, negotiating secession would inevitably touch upon many issues of great complexity and difficulty. In particular, the Supreme Court of Canada mentioned issues related to the economy, minority rights, indigenous peoples, and territorial boundaries. I quote the court, "Nobody seriously suggests that our national existence, seamless in so many aspects, could be effortlessly separated along what are now the provincial boundaries of Quebec." To conclude, the dynamic or evermore autonomy, conceived as an antidote to secession, induces a cascade of perverse effects that risk shattering the state. It is certain that a state must remain attentive and open to the needs of autonomy. That is certain. But a state must not only do that, it must enhance the country's strengths, emphasize its diversity, ensure the proper functioning of its common institutions, refute the unqualified myths that are uttered against it, make clear that unilateral secession is a legal and practical impossibility, and clarify the serious difficulties and consequences of a secession duly negotiated within the constitutional framework for the countries like Canada that accept this possibility. Let me end on a more personal note. If I had no attachment to Canada as such, if I saw no ideal in Canada, and instead saw in it only the instrument to obtain ever more autonomy and devolution of resources for Quebec, a kind of long process of detachment, then I would prefer to be a secessionist. There is more pride and honor in wanting your own country than in staying in a country only to extract ever more power and special status from it. If the majority of Quebecers, my fellow Quebecers, want to remain Canadians, it is because, I'm convinced of that, it is because they are proud of this country, Canada, proud of what they have achieved with other Canadians, as shown repeatedly in poll after poll. Most Quebecers consider their Quebec identity and their Canadian identity as a great complementarity and do not want to have to choose between the two. Plural identities perceived as a strength, this is ultimately what makes the unity of a diverse country. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
D'accord, merci beaucoup, M. Dion. Alors, nous en sommes maintenant à la période de questions. We are at the time of Q&R. So I invite you to write your the Q&A, sorry. And I invite you to write your question in the chat. But first, maybe I will let André a few minutes, perhaps, to as I gather question, to perhaps respond to the comment by both Professor Kerr and the Ambassador Dion.
Yeah, thank you very much, Luc. Yes, thank you to both commentators for their insightful comments. I think, Stéphane, my argument is not really that dynamic autonomy comes only in the form of ever more autonomy, right? So it can be, and certainly in Belgium, it's been the case for Flanders, right? That autonomy has been dynamic in a way that's resulted in increasingly more autonomy for Flanders. But I don't think it needs to be that way. I think autonomy can change laterally. It can adjust in ways that are not quantitatively oriented, right? It doesn't need to be more or less autonomy. And empirically, my case of South Tyrol, I think, shows this. South Tyrol works that way, right? It works with kind of an administrative commission featuring representative of South Tyrol and of the Italian state, which manages the autonomy of South Tyrol, keeps it coherent with emerging kind of needs and situations without constantly bolstering the autonomy of South Tyrol. So I just want to make that clear that, you know, dynamic autonomy need not involve, and I think that's the way you term it, ever more autonomy. Because, yeah, you know, if that were the case, logically, at the end of the day, there would be a logical problem, right? Because when there's no more autonomy to be decentralized, what do you do? So that's really not how I see it. I see dynamic autonomy as being an autonomy that's the subject of ongoing negotiations and discussions and adjustments. And because it's part of a process, you know, conflict becomes less, I think, much less important or explosive than you characterize, right? If you have, of course, one constitutional negotiation, one in a lifetime, and then it fails, then of course that creates a major problem. But if there's a process of negotiating autonomy, of adjusting autonomy, then I think, as in the case in South Tyrol, where there are disagreements, sometimes, you know, there are tensions in the way autonomy is administered, but it's a process, right? It's not a once in a lifetime or once in a generation kind of discussion or adjustment. I do agree with you with about the important shared rule. Of course, my book is focused on autonomy, so I didn't really expound on that. But overall, I think that's a bit of a blind spot when it comes to nationalism studies and federalism, is the importance of shared rule for multinational democracy. So I do agree with that. And then, you know, in terms of the policy advice, again, I want to emphasize, I think there's ways to draw on the book in terms of the importance of dynamic autonomy without recommending, you know, ever increasing autonomy all the time. And there is, you know, again, in the book, I present at least 2 empirical case studies of Flanders and South Tyrol. And then, you know, in the case of Belgium, I mean, most probably don't like the quote unquote Belgian model. But in a sense, I put a positive spin on it because there is the reality that support for Flemish independence is extremely low. And I know you can't comment on the politics of Belgium, but I will say that it's not only because of Brussels. It is not, that's certainly my position, that it's not only because of Brussels. It's not primarily because of Brussels. It's because I believe, as I explained in the book, that Flemings know that their autonomy will be adjusted in time. It'll be done through constitutional reforms because that's the way it's done there. And so they have very little incentive to support secession. And empirically, I do believe that South Tyrol shows the same thing, that there's very few incentives for German speakers in South Tyrol to support independence, although they have done it in the past massively and with violence, might I add. But there no longer is, because since 1972, their Statute of Autonomy has been the subject of ongoing adjustments and negotiations. So I'll react also to Stephanie's comments. I think that that framing, when I got to the end of the book, I thought, you know, that subjective aspect is actually really important. And I hadn't really started with this idea. I'd really started with the notion of like objectively dynamic or objectively static kind of autonomy. And I think that's kind of the next frontier for me in that research, is to look at how things are framed and how that determines kind of strategies and interactions. I mean, I'm less comfortable with this literature, right? This more constructivist literature and social movement literature on framing. But I think you're right. I think that it has to get there. I also have to think about how it's applicable maybe outside of my 4 to 7 case studies, which are all kind of alike in a way to territorialized kind of minority national community. And then I'll also think about your third comment about what does it mean beyond, beyond looking at the preservation of the state, if you will. And it's interesting that, and I'll finish on that, that here you both disagree and agree with Stéphane in a sense. You kind of disagree with him. You say, you're telling me, Andre, your thing is too status, it's too concerned with preserving state unity, but at the same time, kind of Stéphane was worried about the quality of the country, right? That would be left if you do implement dynamic autonomy. And I think, Stephanie, you're also kind of thinking about what dynamic autonomy means for the quality of not only, of course, the country and unity, but especially kind of democracy and representation. So I'll stop here and maybe take a few questions.
D'accord, parfait, André. Donc, une question de Mark Biglery. Given that some of your example relates to the EU, how does the EU fit in your arguments? How do we see Catalonia and Scotland's independence movement, staunchly pro-EU stance? Doesn't adherence to the EU consist somehow of a reversal movement of autonomy? Donc, comment la question de l'Union européenne s'inscrit dans votre argument?
Donc, je pense que c'est particulièrement, je vais la répondre en français, celle-là, je pense. Donc, je pense que la question de l'Union européenne et de la nature de l'autonomie est particulièrement intéressante en ce qui a trait à l'Écosse, parce que, évidemment, les pouvoirs qui étaient jusqu'à maintenant exercés par l'Union européenne vont devoir être, évidemment, sont distribués ou redistribués à l'intérieur du Royaume-Uni. Il reste encore à voir de quelle manière et vers où ces pouvoirs-là vont être distribués. Donc, à mon avis, il y a une chance là, pour le Royaume-Uni de pouvoir négocier et discuter de la localisation là, de nouveaux pouvoirs. Donc, il y a une chance pour l'autonomie écossaise d'acquérir un plus grand dynamisme, je dirais. Même si, comme je l'explique dans le livre, je crois que l'autonomie de l'Écosse a été beaucoup moins statique que l'autonomie de la Catalogne, et surtout là, à partir de la fin de la campagne référendaire de 2014, où les politiciens britanniques ont indiqué qu'ils allaient finalement négocier ou renégocier l'autonomie écossaise, tandis qu'en 1999, avec le réétablissement du Parlement écossais, l'idée c'était que c'était un accord permanent, a settlement. The idea was that Scottish autonomy was a settlement that was, going to remain still for the foreseeable future. So I think there's all this to say. I think the European Union involves potential for autonomy to be negotiated and to be discussed and to be dynamic.
D'accord. Ensuite, on a une autre question que je la lis. Le Canada serait donc, à votre avis, un régime qui propose une autonomie dynamique par voie d'entente et non pas un pays qui bloque les réformes et fait régner le statu quo?
Oui, donc ce que je dis, c'est que si au Canada, on se concentre sur le potentiel qu'offre le fédéralisme, plutôt que sur les changements constitutionnels, le Canada et l'autonomie du Québec devient beaucoup plus dynamique. Et à mon avis, le Canada, depuis, par rapport à l'autonomie du Québec, depuis 1995, en fait, est dynamique, malgré le fait que l'autonomie québécoise n'a pas été augmentée de manière significative. Et je pense qu'il y a un élément analytique important ici, hein, comme je l'ai mentionné pendant ma présentation. L'autonomie peut être gérée de différentes manières dans un même État, certaines de ces manières peuvent être dynamiques, d'autres peuvent être plus statiques. Et donc là, il y a un choix qui peut être fait par les acteurs politiques quant à la stratégie qu'ils veulent utiliser afin de gérer l'autonomie d'une communauté nationale minoritaire.
Donc, pour l'instant, je n'ai pas d'autres questions, mais j'en profiterai peut-être pour te poser une question, André, qui est la suivante. Donc, j'ai bien hâte de lire le livre. Je n'ai malheureusement pas eu la chance encore de lire le livre, là, donc peut-être que tu réponds à cette question dans ton ouvrage, mais bon, tu sembles beaucoup mettre l'accent, bien entendu, sur ce qu'on pourrait, en termes néo-nationalistes, peut-être considérer comme, en fait, je ne sais pas, ce n'est pas des facteurs exogènes, mais c'est-à-dire que c'est des facteurs qui sont externes à la communauté nationale, donc la façon dont le gouvernement central réagit. Est-ce qu'on ne sous-estime pas de cette façon-là des changements qui sont endogènes à la société? Par exemple, est-ce qu'on pourrait, par exemple, faire l'argument que certains font de plus en plus que un des aspects importants de la situation québécoise, c'est les changements générationnels qui sont survenus au cours des dernières années. Le mouvement, disons, indépendantiste québécois a, à certains égards, commencé avant le mouvement indépendantiste écossais, par exemple. Il y a eu 2 référendums, il y a une fatigue référendaire, etc., etc. Donc, dans quelle mesure est-ce que ton modèle nous permet de prendre en considération ces facteurs?
Bien, je te dirais en fait que il s'agit d'une explication alternative à celle que tu viens de mentionner. Hein? Et donc, si on regarde la littérature sur le sécessionnisme, donc pas sur la sécession, mais vraiment sur le sécessionnisme, les auteurs, je pense à Jason Sorens, par exemple, qui tentent de voir parmi les facteurs endogènes, qu'est-ce qui peut déterminer la force de l'appui au sécessionnisme. À mon avis, il n'y a pas, même à travers des analyses à la fois qualitatives, mais aussi quantitatives, il n'y a pas vraiment rien qui ressort. Et donc, je pense qu'on n'est pas très, avancé en regardant ces types de facteurs-là. Maintenant, tu sais que mon orientation théorique m'amène naturellement à regarder l'État et son architecture, etc., etc. Donc, peut-être qu'il y a un biais théorique de ma part, mais même si on parle du cas du Québec en particulier, je sais que il y a beaucoup de... L'argument principal, évidemment, c'est celui que tu viens de mettre de l'avant, je pense, Luc, c'est qu'il y a une nouvelle génération de Québécois qui n'ont pas connu les négociations constitutionnelles et qui donc sont assez agnostiques par rapport à la question nationale. Je ne dis pas que ça ne l'a pas joué, mais je pense qu'on sous-estime le fédéralisme canadien dans cette explication. Je vais le dire simplement. Je pense que le fédéralisme canadien et la manière dont il a fonctionné depuis 1995 a beaucoup contribué à réduire la force du sécessionnisme au Québec. Et c'est un peu dans ce contexte-là que se situe mon argument. Donc, c'est ça, je dirais que non seulement cet aspect-là a été, je pense, presque ignoré, mais je pense qu'à mon avis, il est le plus important.
D'accord, merci Stéphane. Donc, M. Dion avait la main levée, donc je crois qu'il voulait intervenir à nouveau. Donc, je lui laisse la parole.
Oui, mais je peux aussi lire la question que j'ai devant moi qui va me permettre d'aller de l'avant dans mon commentaire. De Patrick Desjardins, echoing some of the themes raised by Ambassador Dion, does this model not risk setting up a collective action dilemma between the central state majority nation in relation to the minority nationalist movements? How can the central state also be sure that minority nationalist movements will also be dynamic rather than static in their preferred arrangements? Alors, professeur Turgeon, j'ai lu donc la question. Professeur Lecourt, cher André, I think vous devez assumer votre concept. Through the book, dynamic autonomy is more autonomy. Never you suggest a scenario where less autonomy would help to fight secessionism. It's always more autonomy, or as you say, a process toward more autonomy. It's not always actual more autonomy, but it's a process for that. So that's what you mean. You need to live with it. And I think, as I said, it's a poor advice to keep a country united, but even as a concept to explain the strength of secessionism is quite limited, and it brings you to be a bit blinded to other aspects that are very key in different cases. If I go, I said about Belgium that Brussels is key. It's not the only point, you're right, but you need, when you think about Belgium, to take into account this huge enclave within the Flanders. That explain why the NVA is officially separatist. They are not autonomous in saying we have more autonomy, we don't need to be separatist. They are separatist. And if they don't propose separation right away, it's because nobody knows what to do with Brussels. So that's for Belgium. You mentioned South Tyrol. It's not because of dynamic autonomy that separatism is weak in South Tyrol. It's because the reattachment to Austria becomes completely almost impossible, since Austria and Italy agrees about the status of South Tyrol. So they need to work on something else, since separation is not realistic and the attachment to Austria is not realistic. It's why secessionism is weak in South Tyrol, it seems to me. Scotland is a very interesting case where autonomy has been given, but they did only that, autonomy. I think Tony Blair is completely right. If you read his biography and his recent declarations, the mistake has not been to have autonomy for Scotland. It has not been to try to avoid dynamic autonomy for ever an autonomy that has no end. It is to have done only that. I will quote Tony Blair. Where I think we were wrong was in believing that evolution would end the argument of independence. Mm-hmm. I do think one of the weaknesses in the way that we approached devolution was not to build real cultural ties and emphasize the enormous things that the different countries in the United Kingdom have in common. So that's really a point where if you do only devolution, you may put at risk your country. And Brexit, which is the new boost that this separatist movement has, is not a case of dynamic autonomy. It's a case of a setback. They had the EU, the Scottish people, and it has been removed without their will for 62% of them. And it's why you have a boost for separation. So it's not that dynamic autonomy has a setback. And Catalonia is the same. Catalonia, the big boost for their separatist movement is when they had a new statute, the Estados de la Autonomía. It has been accepted, signed by the king and so on. 70% or more of them voted yes in the referendum and withdrawn. And then you had a backlash, exactly like Quebec with Mitch. It's a case where you have a setback more than dynamic autonomy. So if there is an advice to give to people working to keep their country united, what is given is given. If you have given an autonomy, don't remove it, because then you may have a backlash. The Basque Coast countries, why they are quiet today, I think there are two reasons. Why? Because their special status has a lot of value today, because it's what Catalonia is asking for, to have the fiscal autonomy that the Basque Coast countries have. So they think, oh, we have that and everybody wants to have it. So they are very satisfied with the fact that they have a special status that creates jealousy from others, and especially Catalonia. And the second reason is because they realize, as all the separatists around the world, that it's not true that separation is easy to do. That the view of many Catalan separatists was, if we declare separation, the EU will recognize us, and then Madrid will have no other choice to accept. Exactly like Quebec separatists said the same. If Mr. Parizeau declares separation, France will support us, and then Ottawa will be in obligation to accept it. It's not the case. There is no way that eventual separation will have international recognition. It doesn't work this way. And now separatists understand that more than in the past, and it's why the support for separation becomes more difficult to have. Puerto Rico, is the economy stupid? Okay, that's the reason why they don't separate from the United States. It's because they have a standard of living much higher than any other Latin American countries. And Quebec, well, I'm proud of what we have done in Quebec. Je vais dire en français, je suis très fier qu'on ait au Québec On a négocié une entente sur la main-d'œuvre quand j'étais le ministre. On a donné à la province, comme à la province de Terre-Neuve d'ailleurs, les commissions scolaires qu'elle voulait, qu'on ait reconnu le Québec comme société distincte et plus tard, sous M. Harper, les Québécois comme nation au sein du Canada uni. Mais je dirais que la plupart de mes concitoyens du Québec sont à peu près pas au courant de ces choses-là. De prétendre que c'est ça qui est le principal facteur qui explique ce qui s'est passé, je crois que c'est une erreur. La principale chose qu'il faut dire, c'est que les Québécois ont toujours été, dans leur grande majorité, très attachés au Canada et que le mouvement indépendantiste a voulu contourner cela par des questions confuses qui donnaient l'impression qu'on pouvait garder le Canada par la porte d'en arrière et que cela, ce n'est plus possible maintenant. Et que donc la rupture que représente la sécession est beaucoup mieux comprise. Et donc, cet attachement que les Québécois ont au Canada apparaît en contradiction avec un projet indépendantiste de façon beaucoup plus claire que c'était le cas avant. Et aussi les difficultés d'une telle sécession. Vous savez peut-être qu'en 1980 et en 1995, il y a eu des référendums autochtones dans le nord du Québec qui disaient que ces populations-là, à 95% ou plus, voulaient rester dans le Canada. Quand on lit les livres d'histoire sur les référendums de 80 et 95, on n'entend presque jamais parler de ces référendums, peut-être dans une footnote un peu distraite, comme si ce n'était pas un événement important. Bien sûr qu'aujourd'hui, on comprend que ça serait très important, que ce genre d'enjeu serait un immense casse-tête si on commençait à essayer de se séparer les uns les autres. Et que ça encourage tout le monde à se dire, ben, on est mieux de rester dans le Canada et de travailler très fort ensemble pour améliorer toujours notre pays. Donc, il me semble que dans aucun de ces cas-là, le concept d'autonomie dynamique, je ne dis pas qu'il n'est pas pertinent, mais il ne m'apparaît jamais comme l'élément central explicatif de tous ces cas-là.
André,
maybe look, yeah, just going to react a little bit. Yeah, first of all, I certainly want to assure you, Stefan, and everybody that I fully assume my dynamic autonomy concept, and I do define it specifically in some parts of the book, and I define it as autonomy that either adjusts laterally or increase. And I agree with you, of course, entirely that retrenching autonomy is the surest way to strengthen secessionism. I think that's been kind of well argued before, Michael Hector, containing nationalism and some others. So again, I just want to reiterate the fact that I stand by my concept, but I do define it in a way that's not limited to always increasing autonomy. On the cases, I think we just disagree analytically on some of the cases. You know, yes, the NVA is formally a secessionist party, but secessionism is not strong in Flanders. Yes, the NVA is the number one party in Flanders, but if you look at polls, support for independence, it's extremely low. And I think it has everything to do with dynamic autonomy. And in South Tyrol, you know, there was, even after Austria and the Italian state, quote unquote, settled the question, there was still strong support for secessionism before the mechanisms of dynamic autonomy through the bilateral commissions were established. So those are more like, and we could go on with the other cases, those are more empirical kind of discussions to have. And maybe in the same vein, it's also you read the question from Patrick Desjardins. You know, I think, yes, it's the question that, you know, it's kind of disturbing to think that things are always in movement, right? And if you want the end of secessionism, that's probably not the right recipe, right? You were quoting Tony Blair, and for me, that's not. First of all, the book is not really about giving advice, right? It's just about kind of finding what happened in these cases. But if I were to give advice, the first thing I would tell politicians and, you know, multinational states is, you know, you kind of have to live with multinationalism, and you have to live with the nationalist movement and maybe a little bit of secessionism as well. So contrary to what Tony Blair said, is of course it's not about kind of, you know, ending that or quote unquote solving a problem, right? But I think it's fair to think that, you know, if you adjust the situation as the circumstances of the minority nation changes, yes, in time there will be other kind of claims and demands for adjustment, you know, but I just don't see it as the so-called slippery slope towards secession that's kind of often discussed. I see there's two more questions, Luc. I don't know if you want to voice them.
Oui, en fait, peut-être deux questions de Jérémy Elmrich. Je pense que bon, j'essaie de résumer rapidement là, la première, mais essentiellement, bon, il fait mention du texte d'Hudson Meadwell, When Voice Encourage Exit, en disant que bon, peut-être ça s'est avéré vrai avec le cas écossais. Et puis, il conclut en disant, cependant, si on regarde la campagne référendaire de 2014, on voit que l'attitude des acteurs politiques britanniques est extrêmement dynamique, avec de nombreuses propositions constitutionnelles formulées. Y a-t-il un paradoxe écossais?
Oui, bien écoute, Jérémy est dynamique vers la fin, à la toute fin. Et en fait, en 2011-2012, ce que considérait et même voulait une bonne partie du SNP, c'était une question à choix multiples, hein, si vous voulez. Donc, l'indépendance, le statu quo ou plus de pouvoir pour l'Écosse. Donc, ça, dans ce type de proposition-là, il y avait évidemment une option où l'autonomie pouvait être ajustée, ici augmentée, oui. Et évidemment, le gouvernement britannique a dit non à ça, hein, parce que le gouvernement britannique pensait, et a eu raison, hein, pouvoir défaire un référendum sur une question qui était simplement oui-non pour l'indépendance. Mais l'ironie, c'est qu'évidemment, vers la fin de la campagne référendaire, n'étant plus certain que la victoire allait être acquise, là, les politiciens ont promis de dynamiser l'autonomie écossaise. Donc, évidemment, là, quel rôle cette promesse-là a eu dans le résultat, c'est pas clair. Mais donc, je pense, pour répondre à ta question, Jérémy, que à une période cruciale, là, elle n'était pas dynamique, l'autonomie écossaise. C'était l'accord de 1999. C'était « it was take it or leave it ».
Et donc, la deuxième question de Jérémy, bon, c'était lié au cas flamand essentiellement. Est-ce que l'appui mesuré pour la sécession en Flandre n'est-elle pas également lié à la nature consociative? Le mot le plus difficile, je suis toujours mes étudiants, le mot le plus difficile à dire en sciences politiques.
Consociative.
des réformes constitutionnelles récentes avec le fait que les Flamands constituent désormais une majorité capable d'imposer leur volonté. Autrement dit, la question porte sur le poids de l'autonomie dynamique parmi les différentes variables institutionnelles.
Oui. Bien, je suis d'accord avec toi que la démocratie consociative en Belgique est importante et c'est ce qui, à mon avis, permet aux Belges de faire des changements, des ajustements dans la nature de l'autonomie. Hein. C'est évidemment, en même temps, les arrangements consociatifs représentent des obstacles. Hein, puisqu'il faut des majorités, une parité au cabinet et des majorités dans chacun des groupes pour faire des changements qu'ils souhaitent faire là, via la Constitution. À mon avis, c'est lié, tu vois. Dans le cas particulier de la Belgique, la démocratie consociative et une autonomie qui est en mouvement, c'est très intimement lié.
Donc, je n'ai pas d'autres questions dans le chat pour l'instant, mais il nous reste à peine 5 minutes. Donc, peut-être, je vais proposer peut-être un dernier tour de table si les panélistes souhaitent faire une dernière intervention liée à des questions ou à des propos d'André ou André des autres panélistes.
Maybe Stéphanie wants to interview.
Sure. So maybe we can talk, build on that last question a little bit, and also that idea of, okay, so if we have a little bit of dynamism towards the end of the build up to the referendum in Scotland, but then we run into Brexit and we run into the denial of potential second referendums or any real discussions there, although we have, as you mentioned, the book, the Scotland Act in 2016 as well. To what extent could we talk about the SNP, if we go back to those questions of strategy and framing, maybe, are they now locked into a strategy of, no, it's static, this is what we're going with? And have they sort of boxed themselves into a corner in that sense, or how much room do they have to adjust depending on how the state responds?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, right? I mean, and that's, again, how I want to kind of approach future research on this, is looking at you know, how actors are able or not able to portray the autonomy a certain way, because I do think that that's a major part of the argument. Like if we come back to Catalonia, right? And I document that a lot in the book, that actors, you know, the traditional kind of autonomous nationalist actor in Catalonia at some point were saying, look, it's closed, the system is closed, it's not moving, and so on and so forth, right? And I do think that if, and that's how it seems to be playing out, that, you know, Westminster, Whitehall, the central government in the UK is looking to, you know, take a lot of the powers previously exercised by the European Union in the name of the market, right? The internal market now is the UK, right? You know, then actually, to come back to Stefan's comments, I think the SNP would be able to say, look, it's actually a retrenchment of our autonomy, right? Or at least it's static, because the powers of the market were previously exercised by the European Union, and now they become, you know, exclusively exercised by Westminster, then it's at the minimum static. So I think, you know, the SNP, you know, seems to be in a good place to argue, right, that their autonomy is static again. Now, and I'll finish with that. Of course, you know, again, my book is not about secession, right? It's about secessionism. And as Stefan said, secession, you know, in the modern advanced industrialized liberal democracy really has never happened, because it's very difficult to convince citizens to choose a citizenship and change their citizenship in the absence of security threats or poverty and all the rest, and then in the uncertainty of the future and of obtaining international recognition, right? So that remains. I guess the main concern of my book was to look at, you know, why do nationalist movements in multinational states, in some cases, are more strongly secessionist than others, and maybe, you know, Brexit and the developments in the UK will be more testing grounds, I guess, to see, to understand the reasons behind these orientations as the SNP kind of takes position here.
Monsieur Dion, un dernier mot?
Oui. Bien, j'ai eu dans ma vie certaines responsabilités touchant l'unité d'un pays. Et il faut se rappeler, quand je suis arrivé en janvier 1996, après le référendum de 1995, quel était l'ensemble des mentalités à l'époque. Le Canada était décrié comme une fédération centralisée, où le Québec n'avait pas sa juste part. On allait devenir anglais si on restait dans le Canada, on allait perdre le français. Il y avait un dédoublement de programme qui mettait le pays en faillite, il y avait un gouvernement de trop, il fallait en enlever un. Donc, on allait tomber en banqueroute. Et la sécession, il suffit que M. Parizeau la déclare après un référendum, et elle était faite. Ça, c'était les mentalités. On n'a pas fait l'autonomie dynamique comme étant la principale chose qu'on avait à faire. On a fait des accords d'autonomie quand ça avait du sens. Mais on n'a jamais dit, parce qu'on fait ces changements, restez dans le Canada. On a combattu chacun de ces mythes-là. On les a affrontés poliment, je n'ai jamais insulté personne, mais on l'a fait. Aujourd'hui, c'est plus clair. Donc, il y a encore de mes concitoyens qui veulent que le Québec soit un pays indépendant, ce qui est tout à fait légitime, mais il me semble qu'on a plus d'informations sur les thèmes du débat que c'était le cas. And if you look at what happened in Catalonia, it's a lot of pedagogic effect. I know a lot of Catalans that are independentists, separatists, and they were sure that the EU would rescue them the very moment they declared their independence. And the opposite happened. And now they understand more. They need to understand that international recognition does not come from unilateral secession in a democracy. It never happened, and it will not. If Barcelona becomes the capital of an independent country, it will not be against the will of Madrid. The same for Edinburgh and London and Quebec City and Ottawa. So all these things we needed to clarify them. And yes, to look at in which way the province of Quebec may have more autonomy, but it has never been the priority. And I'm sure that today is not the main reason why separatism is not as strong today that it was in 1996.
André, je te laisse la
oui,
chance.
Non, ça va me faire plaisir de conclure. Et ce qui me frappe beaucoup, c'est évidemment, c'est que ces concepts-là sont un petit peu, même quand le livre se faisait évaluer, là, OK, travaille sur ta définition de statique et d'autonomie dynamique, d'autonomie statique. Et puis, je pense qu'il m'en reste encore à faire là-dessus parce que Stéphane dit, on n'a pas fait l'autonomie dynamique, regarde, ça a fonctionné, mais à mon avis, oui, c'est peut-être pas l'approche explicite ou ce terme-là qui avait été pensé ou utilisé, mais à mon avis, d'observateur, évidemment, je n'ai pas été praticien, là, mais de ce que je regarde comme observateur, que le fédéralisme canadien avec le Québec a pratiqué une forme d'autonomie dynamique depuis 1995. Moi, c'est ce que je vois, en tout cas. C'est-à-dire que en abandonnant la voie constitutionnelle qui était statique, on a ouvert des possibilités de changement petits et intermittents. L'autonomie dynamique, à mon avis, ça ne veut pas dire qu'on va tout changer tout le temps. Il ne faut pas la caricaturer non plus de cette manière-là. Donc, c'est ça. Donc, mon commentaire final, ça va être que il y a des concepts là, que j'ai créés. Alors, je ne pouvais pas me baser sur aucune définition vraiment existante. Je pense que je vais continuer à peut-être travailler sur une définition conceptuelle plus élaborée.
Merci beaucoup, André. Thanks to all the panelists, the participants, people who came to this very interesting discussion and conversation. And I'm sure, like me, you are looking forward now to read André's book. Alors, je vous remercie beaucoup de votre participation et je vous souhaite à tous et à toutes une bonne fin de journée. Thank you, everyone.